Hi, I'm Tony. Today I'm going to show you how to change the identity source of your AWS IAM Identity Center instance from the internal directory to Microsoft Entra ID using SAML for user login and Skim for user provisioning. This video assumes that you are already using IAM Identity Center for access into your AWS environment with users and groups stored in the internal directory, and that you have set up Entra ID and you want to use that to manage those users and groups in the future. When you enable IAM Identity Center, the service will authenticate users against the internal Identity Center directory. This works great, and in my environment I have created users and groups which my team use to access our AWS accounts. However, now I want to change IAM Identity Center to use federated identities from my company's corporate identity provider, which is Entra ID, so that all of my staff can access AWS without needing to have a separate identity and password to remember. As you will see in the next couple of minutes, this change is simple, quick, and safe. Even if I get the configuration wrong, my existing users and groups within Identity Center will be preserved, and they will maintain all of their existing access permissions. If needed, the change is also easily reversible. Step 1 is to prepare the users that already exist in IAM Identity Center. Okay, here I am viewing my IAM Identity Center instance in the AWS console. In order for my existing users to be accessible when logging into IAM Identity Center using a SAML-based identity provider such as Entra ID, I have ensured that my usernames in IAM Identity Center are formatted as an email address and that they match the email address that the user has in my identity provider. If your users' usernames are not currently set to their correct email addresses and you want to continue using those users, you can use the Identity Store Update User API to update the usernames as required. You can see here that I have a couple of users in my IAM Identity Center today, and me and my team have been successfully using these accounts to access our AWS environment. IAM Identity Center is the AWS recommended way for your human workforce to access AWS, and it's working great for us. However, we now want to connect to our corporate identity provider so that users can use the same username and passwords to access AWS that they use for other work systems. The usernames for my users are already formatted as their correct email addresses, so I'm going to skip ahead to the next step. Step 2 is to change your identity source in Identity Center and download the service provider metadata file required to configure Entra ID. As you'll notice, changing the configuration in IAM Identity Center is simple and quick. However, there is a chance that users could see some interruption if they try to sign in while we are updating the IAM Identity Center configuration. I have already let my team know about this change, so I'm ready to go, but you should plan to make this change outside of normal working hours and communicate this change to your teams appropriately. In my browser, I have navigated to IAM Identity Center in the AWS Management Console, and now I will navigate to Settings. Under Identity Source, I will choose to change my identity source, and then here I will select External Identity Provider. Starting this process gives me access to the service provider metadata file from IAM Identity Center, which is needed to configure Entra ID. So I will download this file to my computer and save it so I can use it in the next step. And then I will come back to complete the rest of this form later. Step 3 is to create and configure an enterprise application in Entra ID to represent IAM Identity Center. So I will jump over to the Entra ID Admin Center. To create the enterprise application, you first need to sign into the Microsoft Entra Admin Center as a Cloud Application Administrator. I am already signed in, so now I will navigate to Identity, Applications, Enterprise Applications, and then choose New Application at the top. Here, I will enter AWS IAM Identity Center into the search box, and then I will select and create AWS IAM Identity Center from the results. Now that the enterprise application is created, we need to configure the attributes and claims in Entra ID so that users are correctly identified when they are authenticated to IAM Identity Center. To do this, I will click on Single Sign-On from the application's main page and then click on SAML. Here I will first upload the metadata file that we downloaded from IAM Identity Center earlier. This contains the basic SAML configuration data that Entra ID uses to connect to IAM Identity Center. Once this is saved, you should see on the page that the basic SAML configuration has been updated. I can then scroll down and click Edit on Attributes and Claims. On this page, you need to verify the unique user identifier or name ID. This claim is how Entra ID tells Identity Center who is signing in, and the value must exactly match the username of a user in IAM Identity Center. In most cases, this should be set to map to the value user.mail, as I'm setting it here. And I also need to make sure that the name identifier format is set to email address. Now that we have configured the attributes and claims, we're ready to download the Federation metadata XML. This file contains the corresponding details needed to configure IAM Identity Center. Step 4 is to complete the configuration in IAM Identity Center. So I will go back to the IAM Identity Center console where we were before. Under Identity Provider Metadata, we're going to upload the Federation metadata XML file that we downloaded from Entra ID. The final step is then to acknowledge that what we are doing will change how users will log in. After we type accept and click Change Identity Source, then users will not be able to log into Identity Center until we have completed the final configuration steps back in Entra ID. You should review these warnings carefully, but also know that this change is reversible, and we can switch back to the IAM Identity Center internal directory at any time if we have issues completing the configuration. After a few seconds, the configuration changes in IAM Identity Center are complete, and we are ready to finalize the SAML configuration in Entra ID. Step 5 is where we will finish configuring SAML in Entra ID by assigning users to our application. Here I am back in the Entra ID enterprise application that we created earlier to represent AWS IAM Identity Center. With SAML configured, we then need to assign users and groups to the application. Only users and groups assigned to the enterprise application in Entra ID will be able to log into Identity Center, regardless of whether they have a user in Identity Center's directory. Or to put that another way, while the internal directory within IAM Identity Center has remembered the user accounts that we had before, the passwords of those users have now been disabled. The only way that users can now log into IAM Identity Center is if they have an Entra ID user assigned to the right application and have a matching user in Identity Center. To add users and groups to the enterprise application, we click on Users and Groups on the left and then select Add User or Group at the top. I'll save you from having to watch me, but I'll repeat this step a few times until all of my existing users that were using IAM Identity Center before have been mapped correctly. Now that my users in IAM Identity Center are now all correctly mapped to the application in Entra ID, they should now be able to log in to IAM Identity Center with their Entra ID logins. If any of my users encounter errors logging in, there are a few things that I will check. Firstly, I will ensure that the user has an account in Identity Center. If they do, then secondly, verify that the attribute mapping for unique user identifier in Entra ID is correctly set. We configured that earlier in a previous step. Finally, you can always reach out to AWS support for configuration help. Step 6 is where we configure Skim. At this point, I have linked my IAM Identity Center to Entra ID using SAML for authentication. So my users are able to log into AWS using their corporate credentials. However, if people join or leave my team, those changes won't be reflected in IAM Identity Center automatically. To ensure that my sets of users are kept in sync, I will now configure automatic user provisioning so that changes I make in Entra ID are replicated to IAM Identity Center automatically. This replication is facilitated by an industry standard protocol called System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, or Skim for short. Configuring Skim is not required to use IAM Identity Center. As I mentioned, my users can now log in fine, but Skim is almost always recommended as we don't want to have stray or orphaned user accounts in our access control system. To set up Skim, we need to first enable it in IAM Identity Center. So here, in my IAM Identity Center console, I will go to Settings and then click the Enable button on the automatic provisioning box. This has enabled the Skim API endpoint where my IAM Identity Center instance can receive notifications about changes to users or groups. I will take a copy of the Skim endpoint and the access token details. Then, I need to configure my Entra ID instance to send all user and group changes to this endpoint. To do this, in my Entra ID console, I will select Provisioning, and then under Manage Provisioning, change the provisioning mode to Automatic. This will open the Admin Credentials dropdown, where I can set my Skim endpoint as the tenant URL and the access token as the secret token. To check that I have entered everything correctly, I can test the connection, which confirms that connectivity was successful and that my Entra ID instance can communicate with IAM Identity Center. So now I will hit Save. Now that the connection has been established, the final step is to tell Entra ID which users and groups should be synchronized to IAM Identity Center. Not everyone in my organization needs direct access to the AWS environment, and your organization is probably similar. With that in mind, I will edit provisioning again, scroll down to the settings box, and confirm that the scope is set to sync only assigned users and groups. This means that instead of syncing all of my users to IAM Identity Center, only the users and groups assigned to this application within Entra ID will be synchronized. Now I can turn provisioning on and hit Save. So now that Skim is configured, I can control who has access to IAM Identity Center by adding and removing groups from my application in Entra ID. The one thing to watch out for is that by default, Entra ID will only replicate users to IAM Identity Center once every 40 minutes. So it may take a little bit of time before your users appear in Identity Center. Of course, it's also important to note that newly added users will not have any permissions in AWS by default. So after they are added via Skim, they will be able to log into IAM Identity Center, but they will not have access to any of your AWS accounts. To give them access to your accounts, you need to assign permissions to the user within IAM Identity Center. As you've seen in this video, changing your identity source to an external identity provider in IAM Identity Center is quick, easy, and safe. You saw me work through all of the required steps. Firstly, I prepared my users and ensured that they had their username set to their correct email addresses. Then I changed the identity source in IAM Identity Center to external provider, and I configured the provided details into Entra ID. Then I configured the corresponding details into IAM Identity Center. During this time, there would have been a few minutes of interruption to my users logging in, so I was sure to schedule and communicate this change appropriately. Finally, I assigned the correct users to the application in Entra ID and configured Skim to keep my users and groups in sync. This whole process only took a few minutes, and now my users can log in successfully with their corporate credentials. If you have any issues in your configuration, there are a few key things to remember. Firstly, this process does not delete any of your users' permissions or assignments in IAM Identity Center. And if you need to, you can switch back to using the Identity Center internal directory at any time. If your users have issues logging in, then the first thing to check is the attribute mapping configured in Entra ID. Ensure that the user identifier is set to user mail. If your users are failing to appear in IAM Identity Center as you expect them to, remember that Skim synchronization only runs once every 40 minutes. You may just need to wait a little longer for your users to appear. And as always, if you have any issues, please reach out to AWS support who can help you through the configuration. They are here to help. Thanks for watching.